Let's go back in time together and learn something new. Introduction. The American Civil War, fought from 1861 to 1865, stands as a defining moment in United States history. It was a bloody conflict that tore the nation apart, pitting the industrialized northern states against the agrarian southern states. The war was primarily fought over the contentious issue of slavery, with the northern states seeking to preserve the Union and abolish slavery, while the southern states fought to protect their economic and social reliance on slave labor. This account aims to provide a comprehensive and detailed overview of the American Civil War, exploring its causes, key events, significant figures, and lasting impact on the nation. Chapter 1: Sectionalism and the Slavery Debate. The mid-19th century United States was characterized by deep-seated economic and cultural differences between the northern and southern states. These differences, rooted in regional interests and historical development, ultimately became central to the slavery debate and played a significant role in pushing the nation toward civil war. Economically, the northern states were experiencing rapid industrialization and urbanization, driven by advancements in manufacturing, transportation, and commerce. This led to the rise of a diverse economy based on factories, trade, and wage labor. In contrast, the southern states remained primarily agrarian, relying heavily on cash crops such as tobacco, rice, and, most notably, cotton. The plantation system, sustained by enslaved labor, formed the backbone of the southern economy. Culturally, the North and South also diverged. The North, influenced by its immigrant population and industrial growth, embraced a more cosmopolitan and diverse society. Education and urban lifestyles flourished, fostering social reforms and a sense of progress. In contrast, the South clung to its agrarian roots, maintaining a hierarchical society with deep connections to tradition, land ownership, and a distinct Southern code of honor. These economic and cultural differences, compounded over time, led to a growing sense of sectionalism, loyalty to one's region over the nation as a whole. As northern and southern interests began to clash, the question of slavery became the most contentious and divisive issue between the two regions. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 attempted to address the balance of power between the North and South in Congress. It allowed Missouri to enter the Union as a slave state while admitting Maine as a free state, thereby preserving the balance of power in the Senate. Additionally, it established a line, known as the 36 degrees and 30 minutes parallel, which prohibited slavery in the territories north of that line, except for Missouri. This compromise temporarily eased tensions, but it did not resolve the fundamental question of whether slavery should expand into the newly acquired territories. The Compromise of 1850 was another attempt to maintain the delicate sectional balance. It included several provisions. California was admitted as a free state. The territories of New Mexico and Utah would determine the issue of slavery through popular sovereignty, and the Fugitive Slave Act was strengthened. While the compromise temporarily diffused tensions, it only postponed the inevitable clash over the expansion of slavery. The passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854 proved to be a turning point in the slavery debate. This act, championed by Illinois Senator Stephen A. Douglas, repealed the Missouri Compromise's restriction on slavery north of the 36 degrees and 30 minutes line and allowed settlers in Kansas and Nebraska to determine the issue through popular sovereignty. The act effectively opened up new territories to the possibility of slavery, infuriating Northern abolitionists who saw it as a betrayal of the earlier compromise and a blatant attempt to expand the institution of slavery. The Kansas-Nebraska Act sparked intense conflicts in the Kansas Territory, as pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers clashed in what became known as Bleeding Kansas. This violence further fueled sectional tensions and marked the emergence of a new political party, the Republican Party. Formed in 1854, the Republican Party united Northern Democrats, Whigs, and abolitionists under a platform opposing the expansion of slavery into the territories. It would go on to become a dominant force in Northern politics and play a crucial role in the lead-up to the Civil War. In 1857, the Supreme Court's ruling in the Dred Scott v. Sanford case sent shockwaves through the nation and intensified the slavery debate. The court, led by Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, declared that African Americans, whether enslaved or free, were not and could never become citizens of the United States. The ruling also invalidated the Missouri Compromise, asserting that Congress had no power to regulate slavery in the territories. The Dred Scott decision further polarized the North and South, alarming Northerners who saw it as a pro-slavery judicial overreach and a threat to their own rights. The economic and cultural disparities between the Northern and Southern states, combined with the failed compromises and controversial legislation, fueled the flames of sectionalism and ignited the slavery debate. The nation stood on the precipice of a violent conflict that would test its commitment to its founding ideals and reshape the course of American history. Chapter 2: Election of 1860 and Secession Crisis. The election of 1860 marked a critical turning point in the United States, exacerbating sectional tensions and ultimately leading to the secession crisis and the formation of the Confederate States of America. The rise of Abraham Lincoln, the Southern states' reaction to his election, and the subsequent failed attempts at compromise all played significant roles in the unfolding crisis. The presidential campaign of 1860 saw four major candidates vying for the nation's highest office: Abraham Lincoln of the newly formed Republican Party, Stephen A. Douglas of the Northern Democrats, John C. Breckinridge of the Southern Democrats, and John Bell of the Constitutional Union Party. Lincoln, a relatively unknown politician from Illinois, emerged as the Republican nominee. His nomination was viewed by many Southerners as a threat to the institution of slavery, as the Republican Party's platform opposed its expansion into the territories. Southern states reacted vehemently to Lincoln's election. They viewed him as an abolitionist and feared that his presidency would lead to the erosion of their way of life, including the institution of slavery. Many Southern newspapers and political leaders portrayed Lincoln's victory as an assault on their constitutional rights and a sign that their influence in the federal government was waning. In response, several states began contemplating the possibility of secession from the Union. South Carolina, a fervent advocate for states' rights, was the first state to secede on December 20, 1860, just a month after Lincoln's election. It was quickly followed by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas in early 1861. These states collectively formed the Confederate States of America, establishing their own government and drafting a constitution that explicitly protected the institution of slavery. Efforts at compromise were initiated in an attempt to prevent further secession and preserve the Union. In December 1860, a congressional committee proposed a series of constitutional amendments aimed at appeasing the Southern states. These amendments aimed to protect slavery where it existed and guarantee the federal government's non-interference with the institution. However, these proposals failed to gain traction, as they were seen as concessions that compromised the principles of the Republican Party and its commitment to curbing the expansion of slavery. In February 1861, a peace convention convened in Washington, D.C., consisting of delegates from both free and slave states. The convention's goal was to find a compromise that would satisfy the Southern states and preserve the Union. However, despite intense negotiations and discussions, no viable compromise emerged. The seceded states remained committed to their path, and the crisis escalated further. In March 1861, President James Buchanan's term came to an end, and Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated as the 16th President of the United States. In his inaugural address, Lincoln expressed his commitment to preserving the Union while acknowledging that he had no intention of interfering with slavery where it already existed. He called for peaceful resolution and urged the seceded states to reconsider their course of action. Unfortunately, these appeals fell on deaf ears, as the Confederate States viewed Lincoln's election as a signal of Northern hostility towards their way of life. The secession crisis had reached a point of no return, with the nation divided along regional lines and armed conflict becoming increasingly inevitable. The failed attempts at compromise, coupled with the deep-rooted sectional tensions and distrust, set the stage for the bloody conflict that would come to be known as the American Civil War. Chapter 3: Fort Sumter and the Start of Hostilities. The bombardment of Fort Sumter stands as a pivotal event in American history, marking the official outbreak of hostilities between the Union and the Confederacy. This event, which unfolded in April 1861, demonstrated the irreconcilable differences between the North and South and solidified the nation's descent into a full-fledged civil war. Fort Sumter, located in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, was a federal stronghold under the control of the United States Army. After the secession of South Carolina from the Union in December 1860, tensions escalated as the new Confederate government demanded the immediate surrender of all federal installations within its territory, including Fort Sumter. However, the fort's commanding officer, Major Robert Anderson, refused to relinquish control. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces under the command of General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard initiated the bombardment of Fort Sumter. The Confederate batteries unleashed a barrage of artillery fire on the fort, which lasted for 34 hours. Despite being heavily outnumbered and outgunned, Major Anderson and his troops valiantly defended the fort until their ammunition was depleted and the structure was severely damaged. The bombardment of Fort Sumter sent shockwaves throughout the nation and presented President Abraham Lincoln with a decisive moment in his young presidency. Lincoln, faced with the challenge of responding to Confederate aggression while attempting to maintain the loyalty of the border states, navigated this delicate situation with careful consideration. In response to the attack on Fort Sumter, President Lincoln made a crucial decision. He issued a proclamation on April 15, 1861, calling for 75,000 volunteers from the state militias to serve for 90 days to suppress the rebellion and enforce federal authority. This call for troops marked the mobilization of the Union Army and demonstrated Lincoln's resolve to preserve the Union at all costs. The outbreak of war and Lincoln's call for troops triggered a flurry of reactions from the American public. In the North, there was a mixture of patriotic fervor and apprehension as individuals grappled with the reality of a civil war. Many viewed the attack on Fort Sumter as an act of treason that demanded a strong response. The call for volunteers generated an outpouring of support, and men from all walks of life rushed to enlist, driven by a sense of duty and a desire to defend their country. In the South, the bombardment of Fort Sumter was met with jubilation and a sense of vindication. Confederate leaders and their supporters celebrated the success of their forces in reclaiming the fort and viewed it as a significant victory for their cause. The public sentiment in the South was overwhelmingly supportive of secession and the defense of their newfound nation. Internationally, the bombardment of Fort Sumter garnered attention and shaped perceptions of the conflict. While some countries expressed neutrality, others saw the events as an affirmation of the irreconcilable differences between the North and South. The international community closely observed the unfolding conflict, with many countries weighing their options and considering potential implications for diplomatic relations and trade. Chapter 4: Early Military Campaigns. The early military campaigns of the American Civil War were marked by a series of significant battles that reveal the complexities and challenges faced by both the Union and Confederate armies. These battles, including the First Battle of Bull Run/Manassas, the Battle of Shiloh, the Peninsula Campaign, and the 7 Days Battles, set the stage for the larger conflicts that would follow, shaping the strategies and tactics employed by both sides. The First Battle of Bull Run, also known as the First Battle of Manassas, took place on July 21, 1861, near Manassas, Virginia. It was the first major land battle of the Civil War and pitted the Union Army, commanded by Brigadier General Irvin McDowell, against the Confederate Army, led by General P.G.T. Beauregard. Both armies were inexperienced and ill-prepared for the brutal realities of warfare. The battle began with initial successes for the Union, but Confederate reinforcements and a strong defensive stand turned the tide in favor of the Confederacy. The disorganized retreat of Union forces marked a significant victory for the South and shattered Northern illusions of a quick and easy war. The Battle of Shiloh, fought from April 6 to April 7, 1862, in southwestern Tennessee, was one of the bloodiest battles of the war up to that point. Union Major General Ulysses S. Grant's Army of the Tennessee clashed with Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston's Army of Mississippi. The battle began with a surprise Confederate attack that initially caught the Union forces off guard. However, Grant's tenacity and ability to rally his troops turned the tide. After 2 days of intense fighting and heavy casualties on both sides, the Union emerged victorious. The Battle of Shiloh demonstrated the high cost of the war and the determination of both armies, setting the stage for more brutal battles to come. The Peninsula Campaign, conducted from March to July 1862, was a Union offensive led by Major General George B. McClellan. The campaign aimed to capture Richmond, the Confederate capital, by advancing up the Virginia Peninsula. McClellan's forces initially made progress, but a series of cautious maneuvers and delays allowed Confederate General Robert E. Lee to reinforce his defenses. The campaign culminated in the 7 Days Battles, a series of engagements from June 25 to July 1, 1862. Lee launched a series of counterattacks against the Union forces, pushing them back and effectively ending the Peninsula Campaign. The campaign showcased the difficulties faced by the Union in coordinating large-scale offensives and the resilience of Confederate forces defending their homeland. The Second Battle of Bull Run, also known as the Second Battle of Manassas, occurred from August 28 to August 30, 1862, near Manassas, Virginia. This battle was part of Confederate General Robert E. Lee's Northern Virginia campaign and pitted Lee's Army of Northern Virginia against Union Major General John Pope's Army of Virginia. Lee's forces decisively defeated the Union Army, driving them back and threatening Washington, D.C. The battle highlighted Lee's tactical brilliance and the Union's inability to effectively coordinate their forces. The Second Battle of Bull Run further emboldened the Confederacy and set the stage for Lee's subsequent invasion of Maryland and the Battle of Antietam. Chapter 5, Antietam and Emancipation Proclamation. The Battle of Antietam, fought on September 17, 1862, near Sharpsburg, Maryland, was a critical engagement of the American Civil War and had far-reaching implications for both the military and political aspects of the conflict. The battle's aftermath directly led to President Abraham Lincoln's issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation, a transformative policy that altered the course of the war and forever changed the nature of the conflict. The Battle of Antietam was a major clash between General Robert E. Lee's Confederate Army of Northern Virginia and General George B. McClellan's Union Army of the Potomac. The battle was characterized by fierce and bloody fighting, resulting in a staggering number of casualties. The Union forces, despite their numerical advantage, failed to decisively defeat Lee's army. However, the battle is considered a Union tactical victory because it forced Lee to retreat back into Confederate territory. Antietam holds immense significance as it marked the first major offensive by the Union Army against the Confederate forces on Northern soil. The battle brought the Civil War's horrors to the doorsteps of ordinary Americans, causing shock and devastation. It exposed the immense human cost of the conflict and intensified the Union's determination to secure a decisive victory. The aftermath of Antietam set the stage for a pivotal moment in American history, President Lincoln's issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. On September 22, 1862, just 5 days after the battle, Lincoln announced that all enslaved people in the Confederate States would be forever free. The proclamation, which took effect on January 1, 1863, declared that all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. The Emancipation Proclamation was a groundbreaking policy with profound implications. While it did not immediately free any slaves since it only applied to Confederate-held territory, it fundamentally altered the Union's objectives in the war. The proclamation transformed the Civil War from a struggle to preserve the Union into a battle for emancipation and the abolition of slavery. It redefined the moral purpose of the Union cause and provided a powerful incentive for African Americans to flee their enslavers and seek refuge within Union lines. The international reactions to the Emancipation Proclamation were varied and played a significant role in shaping the course of the war. In Europe, where there was a growing anti-slavery sentiment, the proclamation was generally applauded. It undermined the Confederacy's attempts to gain recognition and support from European powers, as the institution of slavery was increasingly seen as incompatible with the principles of freedom and human rights. However, the proclamation also faced criticism from those who doubted its enforceability and effectiveness in achieving its objectives. The Emancipation Proclamation had a profound impact on the course of the war. It further galvanized the Union cause, inspiring African Americans to join the Union Army and contributing to the Union's military advantage. It also dealt a severe blow to the Confederacy's labor force and economy by undermining the institution of slavery. Moreover, the proclamation helped shift the focus of the war from mere preservation of the Union to a moral crusade against slavery. Chapter 6, Gettysburg and Vicksburg. The Battle of Gettysburg and the Siege of Vicksburg were two pivotal military engagements that took place during the American Civil War. These conflicts, both occurring in the summer of 1863, had significant implications for the course of the war and the overall strategic balance between the Union and Confederate forces. The Battle of Gettysburg, fought from July 1 to July 3, 1863, in and around the town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, was the largest and bloodiest battle of the entire war. It pitted General Robert E. Lee's Confederate Army of Northern Virginia against General George G. Meade's Union Army of the Potomac. The battle commenced with a Confederate assault on the Union positions, leading to fierce and protracted fighting. The three-day battle resulted in heavy casualties on both sides but ended in a decisive Union victory. The impact of the Battle of Gettysburg on the war was significant. First and foremost, the Confederate defeat at Gettysburg shattered any hopes of a decisive Confederate victory on Union soil. It dealt a severe blow to the Confederate Army, forcing General Lee to retreat back into Confederate territory. The Union victory also boosted Northern morale and confidence, while dampening Southern spirits. Strategically, the Battle of Gettysburg marked a turning point in the war. It thwarted Lee's bold attempt to shift the focus of the war away from Virginia and into Northern territory. The Union's successful defense of the high ground at Cemetery Hill and other key positions proved crucial in halting Lee's advance and preventing a potentially devastating Confederate invasion of the North. Gettysburg also demonstrated the resilience and fighting capabilities of the Union Army, dispelling notions of Confederate invincibility. Parallel to the events at Gettysburg, another critical campaign was unfolding in the West. The Siege of Vicksburg, which lasted from May 18 to July 4, 1863, was a Union campaign to capture the Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg, Mississippi. General Ulysses S. Grant led the Union forces in a protracted siege, subjecting the city to relentless bombardment and cutting off its vital supply lines. After weeks of intense fighting and suffering from scarcity of provisions, Confederate General John C. Pemberton surrendered to Grant on July 4, 1863. The capture of Vicksburg was a major triumph for the Union, as it secured Union control of the Mississippi River. With Vicksburg under Union occupation, the Confederacy was split in two, effectively cutting off the vital transportation and supply route for the Southern states. The fall of Vicksburg was a significant blow to the Confederacy's ability to sustain its war effort and marked a major turning point in the Union's campaign to strangle the Confederate economy. While Gettysburg and Vicksburg had far-reaching military implications, they also had significant political and cultural significance. President Abraham Lincoln recognized the importance of these victories and their potential impact on the Union cause. In the wake of the Battle of Gettysburg, Lincoln delivered his now famous Gettysburg Address on November 19, 1863. In his concise and poignant speech, Lincoln underscored the importance of the Union cause and the sacrifices made by those who fought at Gettysburg. His words reaffirmed the ideals of equality, democracy, and the preservation of the Union as the central objectives of the war. The Gettysburg Address remains one of the most iconic speeches in American history. It symbolizes Lincoln's ability to articulate the larger purpose of the war and to frame it as a struggle for the preservation of a nation dedicated to the ideals of liberty and equality. The address also emphasized the significance of Gettysburg as a hallowed ground, where the fallen soldiers played a vital role in shaping the nation's identity and its commitment to the principles enshrined in the Declaration of Independence. Chapter 7: Sherman's March to the Sea. One of the most notable military campaigns of the American Civil War was General William Tecumseh Sherman's March to the Sea. Taking place from November 15 to December 21, 1864, this strategic maneuver aimed to cripple the Confederacy by targeting its infrastructure, supply lines, and civilian morale. Sherman's audacious and innovative approach left an indelible mark on the war and had profound consequences for both the Union and the Confederacy. Sherman's strategy during the March to the Sea was rooted in the concept of total war. Rather than engaging in traditional frontal assaults and pitched battles, Sherman sought to bring the war directly to the civilian population and dismantle the Southern war machine from within. His objective was not solely military victory but also the demoralization and economic devastation of the Confederate States. The campaign began with Sherman's forces, consisting of around 60,000 Union soldiers, leaving Atlanta, which they had captured in September 1864. Sherman ordered the deliberate destruction of Atlanta's military and industrial infrastructure, including warehouses, factories, and railroad depots. This act of destruction was intended to deny the Confederacy valuable resources and cripple its ability to sustain the war effort. After leaving Atlanta in ruins, Sherman's army embarked on its march through Georgia, covering a distance of approximately 300 miles to the coastal city of Savannah. The march was characterized by a deliberate policy of destruction, as Sherman's troops systematically targeted plantations, rail lines, and other economic targets. The army lived off the land, confiscating or destroying crops, livestock, and supplies as they moved through the countryside. The intent was not only to deprive the Confederate Army of resources but also to break the will of the civilian population and diminish their support for the war. Sherman's march was marked by several notable engagements and encounters, such as the Battle of Griswoldville and the skirmishes at Buckhead Creek in Waynesboro. These actions showcased Sherman's ability to outmaneuver and defeat Confederate forces while maintaining momentum and inflicting maximum damage. The impact of Sherman's march to the sea on Southern morale and infrastructure was profound. The deliberate destruction of economic targets and the disruption of supply lines struck a severe blow to the Confederate war effort. Southern civilians, many of whom had previously believed that the war could be won, now faced the harsh reality of total war and witnessed firsthand the devastation it brought. The campaign shattered the myth of Confederate invincibility and exposed the vulnerability of the Southern home front. Sherman's march also played a significant role in the demoralization of Confederate soldiers. As news of the destruction reached the front lines, soldiers grew increasingly disheartened, realizing that their homes and loved ones were vulnerable to Union invasion. This loss of morale had a cascading effect, undermining the cohesion and determination of the Confederate forces. Furthermore, the march to the sea exposed the limitations of the Confederate government's ability to protect its citizens and provide for their basic needs. The campaign highlighted the logistical challenges faced by the Confederacy, as it struggled to supply and support its armies in the face of Sherman's relentless advance. The destruction of rail lines and other transportation infrastructure severely hampered the movement of troops and supplies, further eroding the Confederate war effort. Chapter 8: Appomattox and the Surrender. The surrender of General Robert E. Lee at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, marked a significant turning point in the American Civil War. It signaled the impending collapse of the Confederacy and the end of 4 years of bitter conflict. The events surrounding the surrender, including President Abraham Lincoln's assassination and the subsequent path to Reconstruction, shaped the final stages of the war and the course of American history. After a series of Union victories in early 1865, General Robert E. Lee found his Army of Northern Virginia severely depleted and cut off from essential supplies. Realizing the dire situation, Lee sought to escape from the encircling Union forces and reach a more advantageous position. However, on April 9, 1865, Union General Ulysses S. Grant intercepted Lee's retreat and confronted him at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. Facing overwhelming odds and realizing further resistance was futile, General Lee made the difficult decision to surrender his army. In a meeting with General Grant at the Appomattox Courthouse, the terms of surrender were negotiated. Lee's men were permitted to retain their horses and personal property and were released on the condition that they would cease all hostilities and return to their homes. The symbolic act of surrender at Appomattox Courthouse effectively ended the military campaign of the Confederacy and marked the beginning of the end of the American Civil War. However, the euphoria surrounding the surrender was short-lived. Just 5 days after Lee's surrender, on April 14, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth while attending a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. The assassination sent shockwaves throughout the nation and cast a somber shadow over the end of the war. Lincoln's death was a tragic loss, as his leadership had been instrumental in preserving the Union and shaping the war's objectives. Lincoln's assassination had significant political and social consequences. It further complicated the already delicate process of reunification and plunged the nation into mourning. Vice President Andrew Johnson assumed the presidency and faced the arduous task of navigating the post-war landscape and overseeing the process of reconstruction. The surrender at Appomattox Courthouse and Lincoln's assassination marked the end of the war, but it also signaled the beginning of a challenging period of reconstruction. The task of reintegrating the seceded states into the Union and addressing the issues of racial equality and political representation proved to be daunting and complex. The nation grappled with questions of how to rebuild the South, protect the rights of newly freed African Americans, and reconcile the once divided nation. The surrender at Appomattox Courthouse and the subsequent events paved the way for the formal end of the war. On April 26, 1865, General Joseph E. Johnston, commanding the remaining Confederate forces in the Southeast, surrendered to General William T. Sherman near Durham Station, North Carolina. This surrender, along with other Confederate surrenders across the South, marked the complete capitulation of the Confederacy and the formal cessation of hostilities. The end of the war set the stage for the complex process of Reconstruction. The period that followed would witness political, social, and economic transformations as the nation grappled with the challenges of healing the wounds of war and forging a path toward a more inclusive and united future. The surrender at Appomattox Courthouse served as a definitive moment in American history, representing the end of a devastating conflict and the beginning of a long and contentious road to national reconciliation. Chapter 9: Reconstruction Era. The Reconstruction era, spanning from 1865 to 1877, was a critical period in American history characterized by the monumental task of rebuilding the nation in the aftermath of the Civil War. The challenges faced during this era were multifaceted, including political, social, and economic aspects. The efforts to reconstruct the South were marked by competing visions, with both presidential and radical Reconstruction playing significant roles. Additionally, the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the United States Constitution fundamentally reshaped the nation's legal and social landscape. Reconstruction began with the end of the Civil War and the surrender of the Confederate armies. The task of rebuilding the nation was immense, as the war had left the South devastated, with its economy in ruins and its social fabric torn apart. Reconstruction aimed to address several key issues, including the reintegration of the seceded states into the Union, the rights and status of formerly enslaved African Americans, and the future of the Southern economy. Initially, Reconstruction policies were guided by President Abraham Lincoln, who advocated for a relatively lenient approach known as presidential Reconstruction. Lincoln's objective was to quickly restore the Union and heal the wounds of war. His plan involved granting amnesty to most Confederates who took an oath of loyalty to the Union and allowing the Southern states to establish new governments once 10% of their population pledged loyalty. However, Lincoln's assassination in 1865 thrust Vice President Andrew Johnson into the presidency, and his approach to Reconstruction would prove to be highly controversial. Johnson's Reconstruction policies, known as presidential Reconstruction, aimed to restore the pre-war Southern social and political order. He implemented relatively lenient terms for readmission to the Union, granting pardons to former Confederates and allowing them to regain political power. This approach drew criticism from radical Republicans in Congress who believed that Johnson's policies did not go far enough in protecting the rights of newly freed African Americans and ensuring a lasting transformation of the South. The tension between Johnson and the radical Republicans culminated in a battle over control of Reconstruction policies. The radical Republicans, led by Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, advocated for a more comprehensive and transformative approach known as radical Reconstruction. They sought to enshrine civil rights and political equality for African Americans in the Southern states and to impose military rule to protect those rights. This clash of visions led to a power struggle between Congress and the executive branch, resulting in the impeachment of President Johnson in 1868, though he narrowly escaped removal from office. The passage of constitutional amendments during Reconstruction played a pivotal role in reshaping the nation. The 13th Amendment, ratified in December 1865, abolished slavery throughout the United States, officially ending the institution that had been at the heart of the Civil War. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, including African Americans, and protected their civil rights. It also provided for equal protection under the law and imposed penalties on states that denied voting rights based on race. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, prohibited the denial of voting rights based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. While these amendments represented significant achievements, their enforcement faced considerable challenges. Southern states, resistant to the changes brought about by Reconstruction, implemented a range of discriminatory practices and laws known as Jim Crow laws, aimed at re-establishing white supremacy and restricting the rights of African Americans. These laws undermined the intent of the amendments and led to the suppression of voting rights, segregation, and racial violence, persisting for many decades. Chapter 10: Long-Term Impact and Remembrance. The American Civil War left an indelible mark on American society and government, shaping the nation's trajectory for decades to come. The conflict's long-term impact can be seen in the transformation of the federal government, the evolution of American identity, and the ongoing struggles for civil rights and racial equality. One of the most significant long-term effects of the Civil War was the birth of a more centralized federal government. Prior to the war, the balance of power tilted heavily towards the states, with a relatively weak federal government. However, the exigencies of war required the federal government to expand its authority and assert its supremacy. The war effort necessitated the implementation of policies such as conscription, the creation of new agencies and departments, and the imposition of taxes to fund the war. These actions represented a significant shift in power towards the federal government, as it assumed a more active and assertive role in the governance of the nation. The war also served as a catalyst for the expansion of federal authority in matters of civil rights. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, ratified during Reconstruction, fundamentally reshaped the legal and social landscape of the United States. These amendments abolished slavery, granted citizenship and equal protection under the law, and prohibited racial discrimination in voting rights. Although the full realization of these rights faced significant challenges and setbacks, they laid the groundwork for subsequent civil rights struggles and provided a legal framework for advancing equality and justice. The Civil War also played a pivotal role in shaping American identity. The conflict forced the nation to confront deep-seated divisions and grapple with the question of what it meant to be an American. It challenged the notion of states' rights versus federal authority and ultimately affirmed the primacy of the Union. The war and its aftermath prompted a redefinition of American nationalism, shifting the emphasis from state loyalty to a more unified sense of national identity. The enduring struggle for civil rights and racial equality can be traced back to the legacies of the Civil War. Despite the abolition of slavery and the legal protections provided by the Reconstruction-era amendments, African Americans faced significant challenges in securing their rights and achieving true equality. The rise of Jim Crow laws in the South, coupled with widespread discrimination and racial violence, hampered progress and entrenched systemic racism. The ongoing struggle for civil rights gained renewed momentum during the mid-20th century with the Civil Rights Movement. Building upon the foundations laid during Reconstruction, activists fought for equal rights, desegregation, and an end to racial discrimination. The legacy of the Civil War, along with the sacrifices of those who fought for freedom and equality, provided inspiration and a moral compass for these movements. Remembrance of the Civil War has evolved over time. Initially, it was a period of deep division and bitter memories, marked by competing narratives and efforts to reconcile the nation's fractured past. As time passed, the war became a subject of study, memorialization, and reflection. Civil War battlefields, such as Gettysburg and Antietam, became national parks, preserving the memory of the conflict and serving as reminders of the costs of war. Monuments and memorials dedicated to soldiers and leaders on both sides were erected, representing a complex tapestry of remembrance. In recent years, there has been a re-evaluation of the symbols and narratives surrounding the Civil War. The Confederate flag and statues commemorating Confederate leaders have faced scrutiny and controversy due to their association with slavery and white supremacy. This re-examination reflects the ongoing struggle to reckon with the legacy of the war and to foster a more inclusive understanding of American history. Chapter 11: Conclusion. The American Civil War stands as a watershed moment in U.S. history, forever shaping the nation and its trajectory. It was a conflict of immense proportions that tested the resolve of the American people and their commitment to the founding ideals of liberty and equality. The war's primary cause, the institution of slavery, was not only abolished but its elimination transformed the United States into a more unified and powerful nation. The Civil War was a profoundly tragic event, resulting in the loss of hundreds of thousands of lives and leaving a lasting impact on families, communities, and the nation as a whole. The war was fought not only on battlefields but also in the hearts and minds of the American people, as the conflict laid bare the deep divisions that had long simmered beneath the surface of the young republic. The ultimate outcome of the war, the preservation of the Union and the abolition of slavery, brought about profound changes to the United States. The war solidified the primacy of the federal government and its authority over the states. It established the principle that the United States was a single nation, indivisible, and that the federal government possessed the power to enforce its laws and uphold the rights of all citizens. The end of slavery, achieved through the 13th Amendment, marked a monumental step forward in the nation's quest for justice and equality. The eradication of this institution of oppression was a moral imperative and a testament to the courage and determination of those who fought for freedom and equality. However, the end of slavery did not mark the end of the struggle for racial equality. The legacy of slavery and the deep-seated racism it engendered would continue to haunt the nation, necessitating ongoing efforts to dismantle systemic racism and fight for civil rights. The wounds of the Civil War were not easily healed. The nation faced the formidable challenge of Reconstruction and reconciliation. The Reconstruction era brought about significant advancements in civil rights, with the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments, granting citizenship and voting rights to African Americans. However, the promises of Reconstruction were short-lived, as the Southern states implemented discriminatory laws and practices that curtailed the rights of African Americans and perpetuated racial inequality. The impact of the Civil War extends far beyond the immediate post-war period. Its legacy can be seen in subsequent struggles for civil rights and racial equality, as well as in the ongoing debates about the balance between federal and state power. The war's lessons continue to shape American society, reminding us of the importance of unity, justice, and the protection of individual rights. The American Civil War remains a subject of deep reflection and study, a reminder of the high cost of division and the necessity of preserving the bonds that hold the nation together. The sacrifices made by those who fought and died in the war, as well as the courage and resilience of those who fought for freedom and equality, deserve our enduring remembrance and gratitude. In conclusion, the American Civil War stands as a defining moment in U.S. history, a conflict that tested the nation's commitment to its founding principles. The war abolished slavery, transformed the United States into a more unified nation, and set the stage for ongoing struggles for civil rights and racial equality. The wounds of the war were deep and long-lasting, but the legacy and lessons of the Civil War continue to shape American society, serving as a reminder of the importance of unity, justice, and the pursuit of a more perfect union. More information and facts. Part 1: Military Leadership during the American Civil War. The American Civil War brought forth a host of remarkable military leaders who left an indelible mark on the conflict. Figures such as General Ulysses S. Grant, General Stonewall Jackson, General William Tecumseh Sherman, and General Robert E. Lee emerged as prominent commanders, shaping the strategies, tactics, and outcomes of the war. Examining their leadership provides valuable insights into the complexities of the Civil War and the contributions of these key figures. General Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant, originally a West Point graduate and veteran of the Mexican-American War, rose to prominence as a general in the Union Army. Grant demonstrated remarkable determination, resilience, and strategic acumen throughout the war. His success in capturing key Confederate strongholds, such as Fort Donelson, Vicksburg, and Chattanooga, solidified his reputation as a formidable military leader. Grant's strategy of relentless pressure, often referred to as total war, aimed to wear down the Confederate forces through constant engagement and attrition. His leadership culminated in his appointment as General-in-Chief of the Union Army in 1864, where he coordinated military operations and devised plans for the ultimate defeat of the Confederacy. General Stonewall Jackson. Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson, a Confederate general, earned his nickname through his tenacious defense at the First Battle of Bull Run. Jackson's military prowess lay in his aggressive and swift maneuvers, which often caught Union forces off guard. He believed in offensive tactics and emphasized speed, mobility, and surprise to outmaneuver and defeat his opponents. Jackson's successes in the Shenandoah Valley Campaign and his bold flanking movements during major battles, such as the Second Battle of Bull Run and Chancellorsville, made him a revered figure in the Confederate Army. However, His untimely death due to friendly fire at the Battle of Chancellorsville in 1863 deprived the Confederacy of one of its most talented and innovative commanders. General William Tecumseh Sherman. William Tecumseh Sherman, a Union general, is renowned for his mastery of the strategy known as Sherman's March to the Sea. As a key architect of Union victory, Sherman employed aggressive tactics, including total war and psychological warfare, to undermine the Confederate cause. His capture of Atlanta in 1864 and subsequent scorched earth march through Georgia aimed to demoralize the Southern population and cripple the Confederacy's infrastructure. Sherman's devastating tactics not only damaged the Confederacy's ability to wage war but also broke the will of Southern civilians, hastening the collapse of the Southern states. His march to the sea stands as a testament to the role of unconventional warfare and the strategic vision of Union military leadership. General Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee, the commanding general of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, is widely regarded as one of the most skilled military leaders of the Civil War. Known for his audacity, tactical brilliance, and ability to inspire his troops, Lee achieved several notable victories, including the 7 Days Battles, Second Battle of Bull Run, and Battle of Fredericksburg. Lee's leadership and personal courage earned him the respect and loyalty of his soldiers, who fought with unwavering determination under his command. However, Lee faced significant challenges, such as resource limitations, internal divisions within the Confederacy, and the eventual attrition of his forces. His surrender to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in 1865 marked the end of the Confederacy's military campaign and symbolized the ultimate defeat of the Southern cause. These four military leaders, among many others, played pivotal roles in shaping the outcomes of the Civil War. Their strategic thinking, innovative tactics, and personal leadership qualities left an enduring impact on military theory and the conduct of warfare. The examples of Grant, Jackson, Sherman, and Lee illustrate the complexities and challenges faced by commanders during the Civil War, highlighting the critical role of leadership in determining the course and ultimate outcome of the conflict. Their contributions and legacies continue to be studied and analyzed by historians, providing valuable insights into the military dynamics and complexities of the American Civil War. Part 2: Role of Women During the American Civil War. While the American Civil War is often viewed as a predominantly male-dominated conflict, it is crucial to recognize the significant contributions made by countless women on and off the battlefield. Women played diverse and essential roles during the war, challenging traditional gender norms and making profound impacts on the war effort. Their involvement as nurses, spies, and even soldiers expanded the boundaries of women's roles in society and had lasting effects on the perception of women's capabilities and contributions. Nursing and medical care. One of the most prominent roles for women during the Civil War was as nurses and caregivers. Inspired by a sense of duty and compassion, countless women volunteered to provide aid and comfort to wounded soldiers. Women like Clara Barton and Dorothea Dix became famous for their tireless efforts in establishing field hospitals, organizing medical supplies, and providing nursing care to the wounded. Through their dedicated work, these women not only alleviated suffering but also revolutionized the field of nursing and paved the way for the professionalization of healthcare. Spies and intelligence agents. Women also played a crucial role as spies and intelligence agents, often working undercover behind enemy lines. These women risked their lives to gather information, transmit messages, and conduct covert operations. Notable spies such as Rose O'Neal Greenhow and Belle Boyd provided valuable intelligence to their respective sides. Their covert activities not only supplied critical information but also demonstrated the ingenuity and resourcefulness of women in wartime. Soldiers and combatants. While the vast majority of soldiers were men, there are documented cases of women who disguised themselves as men and fought in the war. These female soldiers sought to join the fight for various reasons, including patriotism, a desire for adventure, or the need to support their families. Women like Sarah Edmonds, who served in the Union Army as Franklin Thompson, and Loretta Hanetta Velasquez, who fought for the Confederacy as Lieutenant Harry T. Buford, assumed male identities and participated in combat operations. Their bravery and determination challenged societal expectations and expanded the narrative of women's contributions to the war effort. Supportive roles. Beyond direct involvement in combat or medical care, women played essential supportive roles throughout the war. They managed farms and plantations in the absence of male family members, ensuring the production of food and other supplies for both armies. Women also worked in factories, producing munitions and supplies to support the war effort. Their contributions in these roles were critical to sustaining the war and maintaining the functioning of society during a time of upheaval. The involvement of women in the Civil War had profound effects on the perception of gender roles and women's rights. Their participation challenged traditional notions of women's capabilities and opened doors for increased opportunities and recognition in various fields. The war experience exposed society to women's competence, resilience, and dedication, challenging the prevailing stereotypes of women as solely domestic and dependent. These contributions paved the way for the women's suffrage movement and other social and political advancements in the decades that followed. It is important to note that the recognition and documentation of women's contributions during the Civil War have been limited by historical biases and the predominantly male-centered narrative of the conflict. Many women's stories and experiences remain untold or overlooked, highlighting the need for ongoing research and scholarship to unearth and celebrate their vital roles. Part 3: Impact on Indigenous Peoples during the American Civil War. The American Civil War had far-reaching consequences not only for the Union and Confederate States but also for the indigenous peoples who inhabited the territories affected by the conflict. Examining the experiences of Native American tribes and nations during this period adds a crucial dimension to the narrative, as it reveals the complex web of alliances, forced removals, and the profound impact of the war on their lands and sovereignty. Alliances and divisions. The indigenous peoples of North America faced the challenge of navigating the tumultuous political landscape created by the Civil War. Many tribes, already facing pressures from westward expansion and broken treaties, were forced to choose sides or remain neutral. Some Native American nations, such as the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole, had established relationships with the United States government through treaties and had assimilated into American society. These nations often aligned themselves with the Confederacy, influenced by their proximity to southern states and their shared agrarian economies. On the other hand, several tribes, including the Creek, Cherokee, and some tribes of the Great Plains, formed alliances with the Union. They saw the Confederacy as a continuation of the expansionist policies that threatened their sovereignty and lands. Tribal leaders, such as Stan Wadey of the Cherokee Nation, led their people in support of the Confederacy, while others, like Apopleahola of the Creek Nation, fought for the Union cause. The war brought divisions within tribes as well, with some indigenous communities experiencing internal conflicts due to differing loyalties. These divisions often resulted in long-lasting consequences and strained relationships between tribes. Forced removals and displacement. The Civil War also intensified the pressures on Native American lands and increased the pace of forced removals. The Confederate government sought to secure alliances with tribes, offering promises of protection and sovereignty. However, this support often came at a price. Confederate allied tribes faced the loss of lands, as treaties signed during the war ceded Native American territories to the Confederacy. The Treaty of the Choctaw and Chickasaw Nations, for example, resulted in significant land loss for these tribes in exchange for Confederate protection. For tribes that aligned with the Union, such as the Creek and Cherokee, the war resulted in increased tensions with Confederate allied tribes and their American Indian agents. These tensions often led to raids, violence, and forced displacement. Indigenous communities faced immense challenges as they navigated shifting allegiances and struggled to protect their lands and way of life amid the chaos of war. Impact on lands and sovereignty. The Civil War had a profound impact on Native American lands and sovereignty. Both the Union and Confederate armies encroached upon indigenous territories, leading to the destruction of homes, farms, and sacred sites. Battles and military campaigns disrupted hunting and gathering patterns, forcing Native American communities to adapt to the changing landscape and find alternative means of survival. Additionally, the war had long-term implications for Native American sovereignty. The federal government's preoccupation with the war effort resulted in a diminished focus on honoring existing treaties and upholding its obligations to indigenous nations. The aftermath of the war saw increased pressure for the westward expansion of American settlements and the continued erosion of Native American lands and rights. Aftermath and Reconstruction. The end of the Civil War brought new challenges for indigenous peoples during the Reconstruction era. The emancipation of enslaved African Americans and the post-war political climate posed additional threats to Native American lands and rights. As the nation sought to heal and rebuild, policies and legislation emerged that further encroached upon Native American territories, including the Homestead Act and the creation of reservations. The impacts of the Civil War on indigenous peoples are often overlooked in historical narratives, but they are crucial to understanding the complexities and consequences of the conflict. Native American tribes and nations faced significant challenges during this period, with their lands, sovereignty, and way of life profoundly affected. The war and its aftermath marked another chapter in the long history of struggles for indigenous peoples' rights and the ongoing quest for justice and self-determination. Part 4: Economic and Industrial Changes during the American Civil War. The American Civil War had profound effects on the nation's economy, leading to significant shifts in agriculture, industrialization, and labor relations. The war, with its far-reaching impact, reshaped the economic landscape, triggering changes in production, consumption, and the emergence of new industries and technologies. Agriculture and the cotton economy. The war disrupted the agricultural sector, particularly in the South, where the plantation system relied heavily on slave labor and the cultivation of cash crops, such as cotton. With the Union's naval blockade of southern ports, the export of southern cotton to international markets was severely curtailed. This blockade, coupled with the loss of enslaved labor due to emancipation, caused a decline in cotton production and disrupted the southern agrarian economy. In the North, however, agriculture thrived due to increased demand for food supplies to support the Union war effort. Farmers in the northern states benefited from higher prices and expanded production to meet the needs of the military and civilian populations. The war accelerated agricultural innovation, as farmers embraced new technologies and practices to maximize output. Industrialization and the military-industrial complex. The Civil War fueled a significant expansion of industrialization in the United States, particularly in the North. The Union's need to equip and supply its armies led to a surge in manufacturing and the growth of the military-industrial complex. Industries such as iron and steel, textiles, and munitions experienced rapid growth as they geared their production towards the war effort. The demand for weapons, uniforms, and other supplies led to increased production and the establishment of factories throughout the North. Industrial centers such as New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio became hubs of manufacturing activity, attracting workers from rural areas and fueling urbanization. Technological advancements. The Civil War served as a catalyst for technological advancements and innovation. Both the Union and the Confederacy sought to gain a technological edge over their adversaries. The war witnessed the introduction and use of new weapons, including rifled muskets, ironclad warships, and early machine guns. These advancements had a transformative impact on military tactics and warfare. Furthermore, the war accelerated the adoption of telegraph communication and the use of railroads for troop movements and supply chains. Railways facilitated the transport of troops, equipment, and supplies, enabling more efficient mobilization and logistical support. Labor relations and workforce changes. The Civil War brought significant changes to labor relations and the workforce. The war's immense manpower requirements led to a labor shortage in both the North and the South. In the North, the demand for workers in industries and agriculture resulted in increased wages and improved working conditions. Women and immigrants, who were previously excluded from certain sectors of the economy, found new employment opportunities. In the South, the loss of enslaved labor due to emancipation and the enlistment of able-bodied white men in the Confederate Army disrupted the plantation labor system. Planters sought alternative sources of labor, such as hiring formerly enslaved individuals as wage laborers or employing recently arrived European immigrants. Government intervention and economic policies. The Civil War prompted increased government intervention in the economy. Both the Union and Confederate governments implemented policies to support their respective war efforts. The Union government imposed taxes and issued bonds to finance the war, while the Confederate government resorted to printing money, resulting in inflation. Additionally, the Union government implemented protective tariffs to support domestic industries and stimulate economic growth. These tariffs aimed to protect Northern manufacturers from foreign competition and foster industrial development. The economic and industrial changes brought about by the Civil War had lasting impacts on the trajectory of the United States. The war accelerated industrialization in the North, laying the foundation for its emergence as an industrial powerhouse. It also highlighted the importance of technological advancements and innovation in warfare. The disruptions to the Southern agrarian economy and the labor system were precursors to the broader economic transformations that followed in the post-war period. Part 5: Social and Cultural Transformations During the American Civil War. The American Civil War prompted significant shifts in societal norms and cultural attitudes, leaving an enduring impact on American society. The war challenged and reshaped long-standing beliefs about honor, masculinity, and the role of government. Examining these social and cultural transformations provides valuable insights into the broader changes that occurred during this tumultuous period. Notions of honor. The Civil War forced a re-evaluation of traditional notions of honor and valor. Prior to the war, honor was often associated with notions of chivalry, personal bravery, and adherence to codes of conduct. However, the brutal realities of the Civil War challenged these romanticized ideals. The war's unprecedented scale and casualty rates meant that traditional notions of honor could not always be maintained on the battlefield. The tactics of total war employed by both sides, with devastating consequences for civilian populations, raised moral and ethical questions about the concept of honor in wartime. Moreover, the experiences of soldiers and the atrocities witnessed during the war led to a redefinition of honor, emphasizing endurance, sacrifice, and loyalty to comrades. The war experience demanded a collective sense of duty and sacrifice, and these new definitions of honor influenced societal attitudes long after the conflict had ended. Masculinity. The Civil War also had a profound impact on prevailing ideas of masculinity. The conflict challenged notions of manhood and revealed the complexities of masculine identity in the face of war. Traditional notions of masculinity, centered around physical strength, martial prowess, and the defense of home and family, were tested and reshaped during the war. The soldier idealized in the popular imagination, the brave and stoic warrior, became a cultural symbol of masculinity. However, the war also highlighted the vulnerabilities and emotional toll experienced by soldiers. The separation from loved ones, the trauma of battle, and the loss of comrades prompted a reassessment of emotional expression and the psychological impact of war on men. Government and the role of the state. The Civil War challenged long-held beliefs about the role and scope of government. The war necessitated an expansion of governmental authority and intervention in the lives of citizens. The Union government, under President Abraham Lincoln, took unprecedented measures, including the suspension of habeas corpus, the imposition of conscription, and the issuance of greenbacks, paper currency, to ensure the success of the war effort. These actions raised important debates about the balance between individual liberties and the needs of the nation during times of crisis. The war brought to the forefront questions of federal authority, states' rights, and the scope of governmental power. The resolution of these issues during and after the war had lasting implications for the relationship between citizens and the state. Impact on identity and national unity. The Civil War had a profound impact on American national identity. The conflict forced the nation to confront its divisions and reconcile competing visions of the United States. It challenged the idea of a nation united by common values and revealed the fault lines of sectionalism and regional loyalties. The war also played a role in shaping a shared American memory and commemoration. The establishment of national cemeteries, the decoration of soldiers' graves, and the formation of veterans organizations contributed to a collective remembrance of the war. The war's legacy became a powerful symbol of sacrifice and the preservation of the Union, reinforcing a sense of national identity and unity in the face of the nation's bloodiest conflict. Part 6: International Perspectives on the American Civil War. The American Civil War, a conflict that unfolded on American soil, had far-reaching international implications that extended beyond the borders of the United States. Exploring the international dimensions of the war provides valuable insights into how the conflict was viewed abroad and its influence on global events. The war had significant implications for European powers in terms of diplomacy, trade, and the debates surrounding the institution of slavery. Diplomatic relations and recognition. The American Civil War prompted European nations to navigate a complex diplomatic landscape. The Confederacy, seeking international recognition as an independent nation, actively pursued alliances with European powers, particularly Britain and France. The South hoped that these nations, dependent on Southern cotton for their textile industries, would provide political recognition and economic support. European powers, however, adopted a cautious approach towards recognizing the Confederacy. Britain and France, while sympathetic to the Southern cause due to their dependence on Southern cotton, ultimately refrained from formal recognition. This decision was influenced by a combination of factors, including concerns about violating international law, domestic political considerations, and the Union's diplomatic efforts to portray the Confederacy as a rebellion against a legitimate government. Economic impact and trade. The Civil War had significant economic consequences for European powers, particularly in terms of trade. The Union's naval blockade of southern ports aimed to cut off the Confederacy's access to international markets and weaken its economy. This blockade, coupled with the disruption of cotton exports from the South, had implications for European industries dependent on southern cotton, such as textile mills in Britain. The disruption of cotton supplies led to a cotton famine in Britain, resulting in unemployment and economic hardship in the textile industry. European nations, including Britain, turned to alternative sources of cotton from countries like India and Egypt to alleviate the impact of the blockade. The war also stimulated industrial development in Europe, as the disruption of American imports created opportunities for European manufacturers to fill the void in the global market. This expansion of European industry contributed to the broader process of industrialization and economic transformation taking place during the mid-19th century. Slavery and the debate over abolition. The American Civil War had profound implications for the global debate surrounding the institution of slavery. The war exposed the inherent contradictions between the United States' fight for democracy and equality and the presence of slavery within its borders. Abolitionist movements and anti-slavery sentiments gained momentum in Europe as the war unfolded, with European public opinion increasingly aligning against the institution of slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued by President Abraham Lincoln in 1862, further fueled the international debate on slavery. The proclamation, which declared the freedom of enslaved individuals in Confederate-held territory, presented the Union cause as a moral struggle for human rights and attracted support from anti-slavery activists in Europe. The global attention on slavery during the war prompted European nations to evaluate their own relationships with the institution. In 1863, Britain and France issued declarations condemning slavery, aligning themselves with the Union's moral stance against the Confederacy. Impact on colonialism and international relations. The American Civil War had implications for European colonial powers and their imperial ambitions. Some European nations, particularly Britain and France, were preoccupied with their own colonial endeavors during the war. The conflict in the United States diverted attention and resources away from global colonial ventures, allowing European powers to consolidate their positions and expand their influence. Moreover, the American Civil War influenced international perceptions of democracy and the viability of republican forms of government. The survival of the United States as a democratic republic during the war demonstrated the resilience and stability of democratic institutions, which challenged prevailing European assumptions about the inherent weaknesses of republican governance. Part 7. Reconstruction failures and long-term consequences. The period of Reconstruction following the American Civil War was a pivotal moment in American history. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments brought significant advancements in civil rights and the legal framework for equality. However, Reconstruction ultimately fell short of its goals, and the failures of this era had long-lasting consequences. Examining these failures sheds light on the challenges and struggles for civil rights and racial equality that persisted long after the war. Rise of white supremacist groups. One of the major failures of Reconstruction was the rise of white supremacist groups and the perpetuation of racial violence and intimidation. Organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan and the White League sought to undermine the progress made during Reconstruction and to re-establish white supremacy in the South. These groups used violence, terrorism, and voter suppression tactics to maintain control over African Americans and undermine their political and social rights. The federal government's response to the rise of white supremacist groups was often inadequate, lacking the necessary resources and political will to effectively counter their influence. The failure to protect the civil and political rights of African Americans allowed these groups to continue their reign of terror and contributed to the erosion of Reconstruction's achievements. Withdrawal of federal troops. Another significant failure of Reconstruction was the withdrawal of federal troops from the South. As the nation turned its attention to other pressing issues, including westward expansion and industrialization, the commitment to protecting the rights of newly emancipated African Americans waned. The Compromise of 1877, which resolved the disputed presidential election of 1876, led to the withdrawal of federal troops from the South. The withdrawal of federal troops effectively ended Reconstruction, leaving African Americans vulnerable to state-sanctioned discrimination and violence. Without federal protection, Many African Americans faced harassment, disenfranchisement, and economic oppression. Southern states enacted a series of laws, known as Jim Crow laws, which enforced racial segregation and further marginalized African Americans. Imposition of Jim Crow laws. The imposition of Jim Crow laws represents a significant failure of Reconstruction. These laws institutionalized racial segregation, denying African Americans access to public facilities, education, employment opportunities, and voting rights. Through the implementation of poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses, African Americans were effectively prevented from exercising their political rights. The Supreme Court's decision in Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896 further cemented the legality of segregation under the separate but equal doctrine. This ruling legitimized and perpetuated racial discrimination, leading to a long era of racial inequality and social injustice. Long-term consequences. The failures of Reconstruction had far-reaching and enduring consequences. The disfranchisement and segregation of African Americans persisted for decades, perpetuating a system of racial oppression and denying equal opportunities. The economic, educational, and political disadvantages faced by African Americans during this period had long-lasting effects on their communities and continue to shape disparities in contemporary society. The failures of Reconstruction also delayed the progress of civil rights movements in the United States. It took nearly a century, with the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, for significant strides to be made in dismantling Jim Crow laws and challenging institutionalized racism. Moreover, the legacy of Reconstruction failures and the perpetuation of racial inequality continue to be felt in contemporary American society. Racial disparities in areas such as education, wealth, criminal justice, and political representation can be traced back to the failures of Reconstruction and the entrenched systems of discrimination that emerged during this era. In conclusion, while the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments marked significant advancements in civil rights during Reconstruction, the failures of this era had profound and lasting consequences. The rise of white supremacist groups, the withdrawal of federal troops, and the imposition of Jim Crow laws undermined the progress made during Reconstruction and perpetuated racial inequality. Understanding these failures is crucial for contextualizing the ongoing struggles for civil rights and racial equality in American history. Thanks for watching to the end. See you in new videos.